Hey everybody, welcome back to Old World Legends. We're going to dive right back into our special rules deep dive. We're now on part 3. Evan, let's go, sir.
All right, so we've got magic resistance coming up first. So this is a rule that often applies to certain magical units in the game or dwarves just across the board, for example, and it makes it so that the casting
Mhm.
roll when you try to target them is reduced by that much, so -1, -2, something like that. And the good
Mhm.
news about this is that it kind of stacks with whatever dispel bonus you have. So if you're already magic resistance 1, someone targets you with a spell, then it means that their actual roll they get is 1 less. So if they're level 4, then
Mhm.
it goes down to a +3, and then it leaves you now more than 50-50 shot if you have a level 4 dispelling to get rid of any spell targeting them. It often means that if you have magic resistance on one unit and not another, people just won't cast on that unit because of the even
Mhm.
just a single pip of difference is pretty significant when it comes to just not getting your spell off, right? And it's better to have your spell go off against somebody than not go off against anybody. So
Yep.
I've seen people make mistakes on who they try to target, Plague of Rust or Magus Mirage on, just because one of my units had MR1 and they just said, "No, nah, I'm not going to cast on them," and that even if that was actually the game-winning move to do. So
Yeah, it is interesting. The psychology behind it is a pretty big deal, and just exactly right. And but to be fair, a -1 can make a big difference on these rolls. But exactly right. It's just like why take that and go for something else? But typically, you'll see this more often. Besides on dwarf armies, which just applies to everything, you're going to see people will like take their big supreme lord on dragon and they'll double down and say, now let's give him extra magic resistance, just so he has every defensive mechanic in the game that he possibly can, which could be a bit frustrating. But there are, like Evan said, there are ways around it. At the same time, you're level 4, you have a +1 to cast or whatever, you can still power through it and still get spells off. It's just going to be harder if you need to do that. And I think more often than not, the biggest thing with magic resistance is it's not just that casting value. What players will typically do, another thing they'll just do as well. Okay, I'll just work on AoE spells, right? So it's not a perfect defense because you cast a vortex or something else that doesn't target the unit specifically. Well, then the vortex can just move into them and hit them anyway. So, like pillar of fire, stuff like that. So, it is a great rule to have. It's very effective. It really messes up with people, but of course, it's not perfect. But I'm glad that it's in the game, and I love that it stacks.
yeah, hexes are some of the strongest spells of the game when they're within range. It's often more difficult to get within range of hexes. That's why I think the magic missiles are mostly a bit more ubiquitous because of the turn, part of the turn they're cast in, and because you get to kind of move and change your angle before you cast them. Whereas with hexes, the other person basically had to end their turn, just so happens to stance be within range of you and arc of you to be able to even cast it. So that means that they're much harder to actually get off. Basically, your opponent had to make a mistake for you to be able to cast a short range hex on them, right?
Hmm.
But when you do have an MR that really, especially if you have MR2, like from the Collar of Corn or the Brazen Collar, which is basically the same thing, only under a secret name,
Hmm.
then MR2 on a unit, making them be like, I don't care if you try to cast that, probably not going to go off anyway.
Yep. All right, mercenaries.
So Mercenaries is a super fun list of rules that I wish we saw more of. I definitely think that there's
Hmm.
almost a thematic limitation behind this, where people don't necessarily want to bring a bunch of ogre crewmen or imperial ogres in their dwarf list or in their empire list because they want to bring humans and they want more human
Hmm.
guys. They don't have enough points to have some little random unit that might do something, might not, right? Mercenaries don't get to have the inspiring presence or hold your ground from a battle standard or the general, right? So, in the case of a lot of the mercenaries most people have access to, you have these leadership 7 ogres who can't actually use your leadership, so they might just frickin' run away, which is a problem. They also can't be joined by characters who aren't from the same muster list. So that's a bit of a limitation, and it often means that these units are a little bit harder to make it onto the table, but it is super fun to roll in that misbehaving mercenaries chart. I do like that a lot.
Yeah, I love the idea of mercenaries, and again, I think that, to Evan's point, they went a little bit too far. Like we have the version where have bringing another allied faction is too powerful because basically what everybody's going to do is find the best possible thing in that faction and just slam it into their army, and now they get a force multiplier. Or you have the other problem where effectively, like your army specifically is really good at certain things, and here are the limitations where it's not good at, and they'll just all right, well, I'll fill that gap with an ally, which is why allies are typically at events. People don't want bring people being allies to events because of those reasons. Now, mercenaries, though, they're specific units, right? And so, hey, it doesn't have all the big benefits, so forth and so on. And so, it's great, it's flavorful, put it in. What happens more often than not, the penalties of not using the general's inspiring presence doesn't really bother me. The problem is what happens is most of the mercenary options right now are very limited, and in fact, and it's hard to justify the reason to take this unit over just more of your core army stuff. So, I love mercenaries as an idea. They used to see them a whole bunch more with Dogs of War in the past. I'm hoping that we'll see maybe maybe another Dogs of War release or something like that, still in this first edition, and maybe we'll see more mercenaries at the table.
Also, there's nothing stopping them in the core rules of this game from releasing an army of infamy that has a core requirement and
Hmm.
character limit, and then saying you fill the rest of your army with mercenaries from the following list. Have at it. Like a Dogs of War army could be, we've got core,
Hmm.
we've got characters, but then 70% of your army or 50% of your army, whatever, is just mercenaries, and here's a giant long list of all the things you can throw in there. And they all just
Yeah,
have
so
mercenary
we'll see.
rules.
That'd be cool.
So we have monster handlers here. So this one's a bit funny. It's to kind of explain what happens when you've got like a Hydra or Charybdis. You know, those are the ones that come to my mind where you've got these two little guys hanging out behind them with a little stick going like, go that way, go that way. What do you do when you've got these extra little models next to them? I think that a Hell Cannon also has monster handler rule. And so what happens is if
Hmm.
you get shot at, you just roll a die, and a 1 to 4, it goes onto a monster. And then on a 5+, it goes onto a handler instead. So the weird thing
Hmm.
about this is it's kind of like giving you a 5+ ward save because you kind of don't care if the handlers die or not most of the time. Um,
It depends on what it is, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and I think honestly, this is some holdover rules that I think aren't super applicable in the current edition. And older editions, when you're, for the most part, when any monster had its handlers lost, or it's in older editions, the rider on a riding ridden monster, a dragon or something, could be killed off its monster. Then the monster would often go berserk or stay protecting the corpse of its master. All sorts of really fun, interesting things would happen. But now that they've simplified it, so you can't shoot or kill the rider off of a large monster, that they're one combined profile. This is just a lot less applicable, and the few things left that have monster handlers typically don't go berserk, as Evan said. There's just kind of actually you want it to kill the monster handlers because it's just they're just extra wounds effectively at that point. So yeah,
yeah. I
not as
kind of
applicable in the current
I
edition.
kind of think you could very easily just say we're just going to delete that rule and just the guys are just little tokens. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and
You
that would be
could.
fine, honestly, at this point.
Or you could use the rules they use for like a cannon when and its crewman, where if you shoot at it, you attack the cannon, and if you're in combat, you attack the crew. Like there are kind of ways you could get around how to have these kind of mixed units of different types of things beyond that. But currently, it's just kind of this little bit of like a random dice roll. And hey, if you get hit with the cannonball, instead of losing 3 wounds from just the monster, some of them might somehow be on candlers, I guess.
Yep.
All right. Then we have Monster Slayer, which is a super fun rule. I think that we often don't see this because people don't have access to it in a way that they like. If you just
Hmm.
have a regular, let's say, Empire General with 3 attacks at weapon skill 5, he has the same stat line as a freaking Chaos Chosen infantry character champion, right? That's
Hmm.
not that great. And if you just give him a Dragon Sling Sword, which is the only way for Empire to get Monster Slayer, um, he has 3 attacks. It's not really a lot. And then the only thing you have is the Monster Slaying roll. However, if you have a weapon that has Monster Slayer on top of something else going on, that's like really, really exciting. And I think when you do roll that, and it does happen, it very often swings the entire game. So even if it's a small percent chance, it is very, very cool that it's in the game. And it helps combat the I have 570 points of a Chaos Lord on a dragon who has 10 wounds and he has
Hmm.
regen. What are you going to do about that? Well, the Monster Slayer gets to skip the armor and the regen save. That's very,
Hmm.
very good. And most things in this game do not have a 4-up ward save. It's very hard to get that. So, because of that, this is a very powerful ability. All you have to do is just find a way to somehow roll the 6, and you can wipe out something, even the most scary thing in the game, right?
Yep. Nope. It's great to have it, and it definitely influences the way people play. In terms of, hey, I'm going to take this character who is a huge potential threat, and all of a sudden now I'm not going to throw my dragon just into that, or I'm going to hold back. Or it's a great deterrent in so many ways, and I love it. But as Evan pointed out, like the problem is if I'm playing against an army that doesn't have a big threat monster, well, my character typically doesn't have plus strength or plus anything else on this weapon, so effectively now all of a sudden I spent all these points or made this custom character. It's so contextual that it's great when you have it, but you don't always have the number of attacks or the right situation. It's hard to pull this off, right? It either feels like it's super lucky on most of anything in the game that has it, or you're going to be like a Bretonian Duke who just has it inherently, on his abilities, and he already has a ton of attacks, and so it just makes him he was already fantastic. It makes him even more fantastic as doubling down on that. So I wish the other armies that didn't have such powerhouse characters had more access to this in other ways, and rather than the more powerful characters doubling down on their already powerful as is.
Yes. And so it's a bit odd um, that it's not necessarily a problem with the rule or that the rule isn't good. I think the rule is very, very good. It's that who gets to have access to it and how they get to gain access to it is a bummer. Is more than anything,
Pretty
because some
limited.
armies
It's
can
very,
can
very limited.
yeah, and I think it should be limited, but it shouldn't be unfair. It's kind of there's the haves and the have-nots with access to be able to run this.
Yeah. So missed opportunities. I think if they did another pass in the future, I would like to see it sprinkled around some of the other armies that don't have it a little bit more.
So we have Motley Crew, a rule that's caused absolutely massive numbers of problems because the point of this is you have a unit full of different guys with different
Mhm,
equipments.
mhm. This is called the get an argument with opponent and get confused rule. That's what this is.
So the FAQ tried to clarify this by saying, look, if you have different armor values on a unit, you have to just use the majority of the models in the unit. If you have one of every model that has the same armor save, you just use the best one. The problem with that is, okay, so I can get my champion of the Minotaurs to a 2+ armor save, and the other two guys have a 5 or 6+ armor save. And because one of the guys, which is the same number as any of the other models in the unit, has a 2+, the entire unit gets a 2+ save. Cool, I guess. But then also, what happens if this guy's in a challenge or something? Does that take away from that because he's a character now
Mhm,
and he's like a separate dude? And also, if I fail the 2+ armor save, who loses the wound? The guy who had the 2+ armor or a different dude? I honestly
mhm.
don't even know.
Yeah, and honestly, rules like this existed previously for 40K, and they really streamlined it and solved it, and so forth and so on. And it feels like, again, this is just a rule, a legacy rule that they should have, in my opinion, streamlined this more. I get why it still exists. I still want it to exist in the game, but ultimately, it's causing too much friction, not on the output, the damage output side, but the damage receiving side. I think they should take another look at this and address it in a more elegant way in the FAQ. That their simplified approach to just do this did not cover the loopholes in the way that it's going to be used by players.
So we're going to see a lot of it with the Minotaur Warherd because you can get a Doom Bull or Gore Bull to a 2+ armor save, and then you can also get the champion
Yeah.
to a 2+ armor save. You've got two guys in the front rank who have 2+ armor saves. However, both of them are characters and/or champions who have the 2+, and all the other guys are 6 up, 5 ups or something. And so technically the whole unit has the 2+ save, but again, I still have the problem of okay, it says remove models equally from the two different kinds or however many kinds in the fighting rank. Great. Well, one of them's a character, so don't know how that works. And the other one's a champion. So am I supposed to remove, like, let's say I suffer 6 unsaved wounds or 4 unsaved wounds, right? And I've got these 3 wound minotaurs. How do I remove an equal number of 6 up armor saves, 5 up armor saves, and 2+ armor saves of the 3 different kinds out of the 4 wounds I lost?
Yeah,
I
it's a
don't
problem.
know. So
They're
if you have
trying to
multi wounds, it
again,
doesn't make
it's
sense at all.
they're trying to do exactly right, and they were trying to streamline it, but really it should just be whatever the arm. You assign which model is which armor save you're going to use, and you apply wounds until that model's dead, and that's what 40K did, and it solved it. So
Yeah, I
hopefully
think
they
perfectly
address it in the
fine. We're going to
future.
use the best armor save, but then the guy who's taking that save, he's the one
He
losing the
takes the
wound. So if
wounds.
you if the character or the champion has the 2+ save and we lose a wound, then that's the model that needs to lose it, so that when he dies, then it reverts to the worst save. Fair. I think that's fair enough,
And
right?
the reason why it works really well again in that version too, because if you once he takes a wound, right, effectively he's now wounded. So any other attacks that go into the unit have to be applied to that person. You can't now do a wound to somebody else. So it's actually a risk for reward. Do I want to put up my 2 up save now? Because as soon as he takes a wound, I have to keep applying the wounds, and I might want to save him for when something else is attacking. I want to save those 2 up saves. So this has been solved in other GW game systems. I think they should bring over the solution here.
Also, we have the different armor values. You could just take rolls for each individual guy who is then losing wounds. So if I'm removing runes from a model that has a 5 up save, that's the armor save I'm taking until that guy dies. Then I start taking armor saves on a better roll until that guy dies. You know what I
It
mean?
just slows the game down, but that's how you need to address it.
But I feel like then it actually makes some level of sense. The entire Minotaur unit having a 2+ save when most of them are naked makes no sense at all.
I fully agree. So, yeah, just pointing out the challenges with this. Hopefully, it gets addressed. Move and shoot.
So this is one of the least, like, one of the most hated rules in the game for how it's named, because it's not move and shoot, it's march and shoot.
I know it's so. Why did they call it that? Yeah,
Okay.
And then if that wasn't confusing enough, it's move and shoot, and then they have move or shoot. In case you weren't confused before, they're going to make sure you're confused after you
Well, in
see both
particular, I
seven.
imagine people who are English as their second language, this is gonna like really drive you nuts.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So not the best, but anyway, if you do have the rule right, effectively it allows you to shoot after you've marched. So yes, it should have just been march and shoot would have been the correct, better label for that rule.
So here's the
Yep.
situation that happens all the time. Someone takes some flamers of Zinch and flies them 12 inches at me. I'm like,
Mhm.
ah, that's scary. Then they rolled a hit, and I'm like, but didn't you just march? And he says, no, they're move and shoot. And then you go, but that doesn't. But you just marched. And then you go, no, 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 move and shoot. You know the rule where you get to march and shoot. That one,
Mhm.
not quickfire,
Yep.
which is where you ignore the moving and shooting penalties, which is a different rule.
Yeah. Totally different rule. Yep. Oh boy. All right. So move or shoot. This is different though.
Yeah, move or shoot is that it's the total opposite of that. You can't shoot if you move. Generally, this is just on every single war machine, so you can't like unless you have X Force or something, you can't like
Mhm.
move the 3 inches and then still fire your cannonball.
Yep. And I get why they call it that to try and convey that, but again, it's also confusing. Even if it was march and shoot and then having move or shoot, right? It should really just be like, heavy weaponry or something. They should have given it a different label to avoid some of this confusion between the two special rules being named so similar. I
I
get
think
it's
I
not
like the
wrong.
idea of
It's confusing.
cannot move and shoot.
Sure, even that. Just they needed to make the wording more of a delta between the phrases. But yeah, but
Yeah.
this is effectively one of those penalty ones. It's a special rule that effectively this is just typically slapped on things to have some sort of downside to how powerful its output typically is.
So then we have move through cover, one of the most disappointing rules in the game for me personally, because it lets you not suffer the penalties of your movement characteristic for moving through difficult dangerous terrain. It does nothing whatsoever for the whole I'm going to drop the highest dice on my charge roll, which means my move through cover white lions and my move through cover beastmen, whatever the heck, still take the lower of the two dice when they're trying to charge anybody. And so that one
Mhm.
inch that I didn't lose going through the woods meant almost nothing. And it means that move through cover infantry is still much slower and worse than I just have swift stride lol cavalry who just charge from across the forest like it's not even there.
Yep, I agree.
It's a
I
bit
really
weird.
wish they would go back and address this and also remove that charge roll penalty if you have this special rule. I think in particular, this is almost always an infantry rule. It can be on Sun Cavalry, but this is very much an infantry rule, and I think it would just make infantry feel better, the ones that do have this. Yep.
Yeah. Lets you reroll ones on
But-
your Danish train test though, which is super super cool, and you get to use it on things like walking over vortexes and stuff, which is great.
mhm.
So don't
And I do
forget
like
about
you
that.
don't ignore dangerous terrain because it still feels dangerous. It just reduces the odds of you hurting yourself. Rerolling the ones is significant on dangerous terrain to be able to reroll that. So it really reduces the odds you're going to hurt yourself, but there's still a chance. So I like that it didn't just remove that. So I think that was a good decision.
So multiple shots is a bit of a sad rule, mostly just because of how many other ballistical penalties there are. So it lets you fire multiple attacks with a weapon, but no matter how many
Mhm.
shots, how many multiple shots you have, um, you still suffer -1 to hit. And what's a bummer about this is there's a large number of weapons in the game that are multiple shots too, where
Mhm.
having two shots at -1 to hit is often worse than one shot without the minus, which is like annoying.
Mhm.
When I'm playing Dark Elves and
Yeah,
I have all my
it's
little repeater crossbows and I have to constantly be like, should I multi-shot? Should I not? It's like, can we not? Can we just not do
yeah.
this?
I just wish because exactly right. It's putting the players having to do the math to figure out whether they should or shouldn't do this. And so I just don't I just wish it was more positive. And again, this is just general. In this edition, the ballistic skill shooting is so difficult to be effective with anything ballistic skill shooting. This is another example where I wish it was just nope. It's just a benefit. You're just allowed to shoot this weapon multiple times. There is no further penalty for shooting it multiple times. It's a just a good thing, and that's just because the ballistic skill shooting is so difficult to actually be effective with in the current edition.
Okay, multiple wounds X. So I think a lot of people are familiar with this one because ogre blades exist. But essentially, the idea
Hmm.
is that you can actually do multiple wounds of damage in a single turn or a single attack from cannonballs, ogre blades, things like that.
Hmm.
Really interesting that we have an edition where there's all kinds of monsters, there's all kinds of ridden characters who have more wounds than we've ever seen before.
Hmm.
Outside of I think in end times there was people like Malekith had like 10 wounds because he was riding a dragon, so it was all just one profile. He had 10 wounds, right?
Yeah, but
Um,
not it was not common, right? It was very
yeah.
uncommon to have 10 or more. Yep.
Yeah, and he was like way more points even than a dragon is today. I think it was something like 800 something points
Hmm.
for that
Yep.
dude. Um, but here we have multi wounds where it really interesting. I looked through 8th edition a lot. There's very very little multi wounds. Like a cannonball was one of the only things in the game that could actually remove more than one wound at a time. There was not a lot of
Yep.
magic weapons that did that. So if
Nope.
someone had 5 wounds, you had to actually just hurt them 5 different times instead of just, oh, I got 2 ogre blade hits and I rolled a 5 and a 6. You're dead now, which happens to me
Unless you had killing
constantly.
blow. Yeah.
Yeah, Killing Blow, and it made Killing Blow and the heroic Killing Blow, which is Monster Slayer from previous editions, more
Hmm.
interesting because that was one of the ways to kill someone quickly. Where now multi wounds kind of just simplifies that into here you have more average damage just having multis,
It's
chunking through
good.
people
I
one at
like
a
I
time.
like having the spectrum of potential damage outputs. It makes weapons feel more different. That they're some are better than others. Higher risk, higher reward, and there's definitely more of it in this edition, but still not super common. It's not all over the place. It's definitely more common in magic weapons though than it was in previous editions.
Yeah, I will just say though that having a lot of multi wounds in the game is really really good when there's all kinds of monstrous characters riding around with lots of wounds going on, and it
Hmm.
sucks horribly for if you actually try to play a casual game and you bring a vampire lord on foot or a chaos lord on foot or let's just say an empire general on foot, and any of those dudes who don't have 8, 9, 10 wounds each, if they just get by a single ogre blade and the person rolls a 5 up, they just get one shotted by a weapon that's already good against plenty of other things in the game, but it's also just completely puts them out of the box of being able to be usable. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair that in the current edition, because they went with the combined profiles with characters writing monsters, there's pros and cons to that decision. And some of the ripple effects of that decision is that they added more multi wounds to help create more, if you didn't have Monster Slayer, more ways to deal with those multi wound things. But effectively, that also created a significant delta and probably it actually made a they were trying to give you ways to deal with the threats of those characters on those combined room profile models, and effectively, it's having a
Yeah.
really inverse, super negative effect for the non-character writing monsters to the point where in the current edition, it's like, gee, if I have a melee character who wants to get into combat, I really have to put him on a monster. Otherwise, in this edition, he's not as much of a threat. He's too vulnerable, significantly too vulnerable. And I think this is some of the perhaps unforeseen side effects of those decisions, ripple effects of those decisions.
Some of the only foot characters who can exist are things like Demon Prince, Ogre Tyrant, and Doombull, who have 4 or 5 wounds even though they're infantry.
Because
And
they're monstrous
yeah,
infantry.
because they're
Yeah.
monstrous infantry, and then they're a little bit more available to not die to multi wounds, and then they have a lot of extra attacks as well. So they're almost a monster by themselves. They're kind of partway there. Um,
Mhm.
and so those are the ones that can exist. Whenever I put whenever I put my Beast Lord on foot with 3 wounds, I'm like, oh no, this is scary.
Yep.
In
Yep.
particular, 3 is a really bad number because Ogre Blade's super super common. You get a single hit go through, fail my save. I'm like, cool, roll your D3 there, man. And so many of the times they just roll the 5 or 6 on the first hit that goes through, and I just insta die from a single Ogre Blade hit.
Yep.
So
Yep.
much so that
Four's
when
the
I
sweet
take
spot.
a Vampire Lord on like horse or on foot, just because I'm playing like a casual game with one of my friends, I always take the 50 point upgrade to give myself a 4th wound so that this does not happen.
Yeah, but it's just annoying. So, yep, I think that's a general synopsis. I would love to see.
Yeah.
Good to see multi wounds because the ogre blade is so prolific because it is the best weapon in the game. Period, by far for melee weapons. That's also exacerbating this problem. So, there's a
So
few of ways they could go about approaching this.
there's a super interesting way to fix this. There was a multi wound weapon. I don't know whether it was Beastmen or Wood Elves that came out just very recently, where it said, okay, yeah, you have multi wounds, but only against things that are monster or chariot or something like that. So it basically didn't work against infantry and cavalry, who would
That
only have a
I
couple
would love
wounds.
to. I would love to see that applied to the ogre blade. I think that would be healthy for the game.
And I think people would still take it just as much because there's plenty of monsters to fight. But then if anyone just happens to
Absolutely.
not have one of those, not just getting chunked down in a single hit would make it just actually a little bit more of a fair fight. Because in other words, the Overblade usually doubles your damage output because you have the D3, but it can spike into
Hmm.
triple, which is a lot.
Hmm. Yep.
All right.
Yep. I think that'd be really cool. Moving on.
Open order is a special rule that lets you have the open order formation. We're just going to have to do a different video about formations in general, but it's a very cool formation. It doesn't get used enough. We'll definitely talk about that more later.
Yeah, I think most people forget it even exists. So it is cool, and yeah, let's move on. We'll do a bigger dive in that later.
Hot take, maybe we could just not have skirmishers and use that instead because that would make the game not have skirmishers in it, which don't make any sense.
Skirmishers will always have a place in the game. There's just the current edition has some chunk to
I
it,
don't
but
think any
that's a different
cavalry
video.
unit should be skirmish. It's very weird to have cavalry with skirmish.
Well, again, fast cavalry and skirmish used to had more of a delta in their rules. In the current edition, there's almost no delta in the rules. So that's another valid criticism. But let's dive into that when we get into
Sure,
formations.
yeah, yeah. So poisoned attacks, another holdover from previous games where basically if you have the roll to 6 to hit, you automatically wound.
Hmm.
It's a bit overpowered because the vast majority of things that have poisoned attacks are like a strength 3 attack. So it
Hmm.
often means that a poisoned bow shot has 5 times more damage output versus something that's like toughness 6 than a regular bow shot.
Hmm. Yeah,
That's a
it
very
is.
large delta.
I think right. The point of it was to give armies that they were trying to create another version of a mechanic to take down the large targets. But exactly to your point, Evan, in terms of the delta of damage, effectively the way the rest of the game is balanced. If I had 50 strength 3 bow shots with no poison, or even strength 4 bow shots with poison, trying to wound that T6 dragon, I still have to hit and then I have to roll to wound, right? Versus poison, effectively the mathematically the poison shots, even like a third, they're double or more effectiveness, just because the 6 is automatically wound. And so I get why they're in the game, but I think the mathematical balance of them should be reevaluated.
So, hot little fun fact for you here is that a lot of people forget this. You can't use spells or attacks with magic weapons with your poison attacks. So, if you have a Strigoi Ghoul King and you don't want to use his hand weapon, you give him any magic weapon in the game. He now doesn't get poison attacks anymore, which is kind of sad. Same thing for a Death Hag. She just loses that if she picks up any other kind of weapon. Um, so just remember that that's how that works.
Yep, people forget all the time.
And then the one exception to that is if the weapon itself gives you poison, which kind of is confusing for a lot of new people. They're like, but wait, poison doesn't work with magic weapons unless if it gives it to you.
Yep, a little bit confusing.
Yes.
Yep. So I like poison, but I think it should be. I think there's an opportunity for reworking that for the current edition.
My hyper hot take is that poison should be if you get the 6 to hit, you wound on a 4 plus. So it just flattens it in the exact same way that like I think Slayers have that rule.
Hmm.
Similar type of rule where they rewrite that rule all the time and then poison something totally different that's even better. So if you could just have it be one on the 4 plus when you get that critical hit, that would then level the playing field and it wouldn't be automatic wounds versus like basically wouldn't help you at all if the thing wasn't tough, right? So if you fire a bunch of poison arrows at some light cavalry, it wouldn't change anything.
Yep. Yep. There's definitely ways to make that a lot more feel better for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Ponderous is
yeah.
-2 to hit if you move and shoot, which basically means you're just not going to move and shoot because you just can't hit the setup barn anymore.
Yep. So that's one of those again, another special rule that's just a negative, and this is just something they can apply to some things to say you really shouldn't be moving with this. And again, that's a way to balance some of those weapons that are really powerful in their
I
potential
think like the
output.
grenade launching blunderbuss is what I'm thinking of that has this,
Mhm.
but it's
There's
still
a
really
few others.
funny.
Yeah. Yep.
And then you have quick shot. Hey, at the very least,
Hmm.
these somehow ended up next to each other because they're not the same letters, but they ended up next to each other. So this is -2 for moving and shooting. Quick shot is no minus at all for moving and shooting, and you can make a
Hmm.
stand and shoot when they're regardless how close they are. So you often see this on things like grenades. They have like quick shots.
Hmm.
They can stand and shoot with some kind of a grenade they can throw, like the dwarves have, or you see it on pistols and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great rule. One of the better rules. If you have ranged weapon that has it, it's fantastic.
All right, rallying cry is super interesting. I really like that we built rules like this in the game where it gives like the commanders who aren't wizards, who aren't melee combat guys, to have something they could do. So
Hmm.
if they if they're in their command subphase, their turn, they can pick at least one unit nearby and then just make that unit re-roll their rally test, or basically roll
Hmm.
their rally test ahead of time, letting them rally
Hmm.
before they might have done so. And in the case of a wizard, you can then rally them and then get to. It happens before the enchantments and hexes, so you could rally
Hmm.
them and then enchant and hex, with Rallying Cry. If you don't have Rallying Cry, you have to wait until after that subphase has ended. So if you rally a wizard who is fleeing, he then doesn't get to cast Plague of Rust normally.
Yeah, well, I love exactly right. I love that they broke it out as its own special rule. What I'd love to see more in the future is to see Rallying Cry not so focused on your melee dedicated characters. I'd love to see more utility type characters that bring things like this to the table. I view this as something like, again, like a priest of Sigmar, right? Or who roll. Ideally, you'd roll on your leadership to cast his stuff. But similar to, again, I love utility characters. So it's like, hey, here are my melee characters, here are my wizard characters, here's my utility characters, here's my war machine characters, right? And they all serve a very different role on the battlefield. And I love that versus what often happens is they put Rallying Cry on your melee character. My melee character wants to go ahead and charge that thing over there, versus you want your utility character that's hold the lines with your troops to be someone who's holding back. So I
Yeah,
love that they're breaking it out. I'd like to see more utility characters with more of these mechanics to see more variety in the archetypes of the characters on the battlefield.
yeah. An Empire General is basically a utilitarian character. Don't worry.
Well, you're not wrong about that. But that's for a different reason. All right, random attacks.
So random attacks is kind of obvious. Basically, you just roll the dice for how many attacks you make. The thing that's a little bit less obvious is if you have, like, let's say Forsaken, every individual guy rolls the dice. You don't just roll once for the whole unit and then they all get 3 attacks if you get lucky.
Mhm,
Instead, you roll for each individual guy, which is fair enough. I guess it's just balanced out that way. But don't worry, they also
mhm.
have Furious Charge. They probably have freaking 4 attacks each. So,
Yeah, because they're awesome. Yep. hmm
ew,
Pretty
no,
straightforward.
no, no.
Yeah. While you say like hey, it'd be great if you spike. It's also really feel bad if you roll one die for the whole unit and get a one for the entire unit.
Yeah.
So rolling individually averages out the results. You could still spike, high or low, but it generally will. It has less highs, but it also has less lows. So
So then we have
pros and
random
cons.
movement, a rule that causes all kinds of problems in the game because
Oh boy.
yeah. So you roll dice to see how far you get to go, and after you see the number, you then get to choose where you want to go. I
hmm
really think this is a downgrade. It used to be you would pick your unit and you just point it in a given direction and roll the dice, and that's how far you went in that direction. So if you try to
hmm
move towards someone and try to charge them, you would roll the dice, and if you didn't roll high enough, you just would move forwards and just sit there. But now
Yep.
you roll the dice first and then decide, oh, I'm within range to wheel around in a 360 and plug some wizard who's next to me now, like you did, Mike, to me.
Did I?
Yeah, one of your gigantic chaos spawn, after it killing blowed all of my dragon ogres to death, it
Yeah,
then
that
was
was
sitting
cool.
right next to my shaman, like 4 inches, like an out of line of sight arc, and you were able to just roll the dice and say, "Oh, look, I can move 9 inches," and you just wheeled all the way around and bumped my shaman, who can't go run away, and he
I
just
didn't
died.
charge him though. You could have charged him with that. It wasn't in the arc.
No, you can charge people outside arc. You did it to me because Mike,
Uh,
you have to be able to. So the arc thing is all about declaring a charge. They don't declare charges.
that's true.
So all you have to do is just move into the right arc of the enemy unit you want to charge. But if it's skirmisher, there is no arc to charge.
That
You
was
get to
it. They had to right. They had to be in the same
so
arc
you
of
so
where they
you
would
no
charge.
longer
That
can spaghetti wheel yourself around into the flank when you started in the front. You can't do
that
that.
that's what I was thinking of. Yes, yes,
But
yes,
what you
yes, yes.
can do is if you're facing a totally different direction, like a puppy dog, and you're just like, oh, what's that
hmm
way? You can just go in a big circle and hit someone who's trying to hide from the line of sight, and so that you can do.
Yeah, yeah, and debatable whether they should or shouldn't be able to do that. Yep, yep, that's a hot topic. And yeah, so random movement can be fun, but I think it could use some refinement for sure.
There is uh, a bit of a problem with random movement that they only use pretty much d6s for this. And then the thing is that 2d6 is actually pretty slow because on average it's 7 inches, which is less than a 4 inch move infantry unit that marches.
hmm
So that's
Yep,
slow. But 3d6 is sometimes 18-inch charges, which is
yep,
very fast.
high variance. Yep,
So the problem
yep.
is anything that has random movement 2d6 is probably really bad, and anything that has random movement 3d6 is probably way too good, and I don't know what to do about that.
Well, the way you do it is you give them it's 2d6 plus 1 or 2d6 plus 2. That's
That
how
would
you solve
be,
that.
I just mean I don't know what to do about it when I'm playing against it. Because when I'm playing against a
That
full army of night goblins that all have random movement, like Jonathan's list, I'm just gritting my
Yep.
teeth. Because the other thing is, I don't get Santa shoots against these like t-shirt guys
hmm
who are squig hopping towards me, and you
You
can't flee as a charge
could
reaction either.
you could actually take screens to put in front of your units because
But
you
then
don't
they
know what the
die and they
enemy's
get
going to
overrun
do.
through, so you can't really do anything like
Well,
that.
you don't need to be not you could sit behind the screen. There are things you could do, sir. You were just choosing not to do them
I was
because
sitting
it's
on the
not the
back
most
line trying to
effective
hold my
solution.
objectives against an entire wall of random moving guys who just absolutely murdered me.
Well, maybe you should kill them faster. I don't know. Anyway, random movement can be a lot of fun. Can be some surprise. That definitely happens. All right, regeneration.
So regeneration is a third save, and I think the probably the most contentious one because everyone thinks, okay, yeah, sure, armor makes sense, and the ward save is essentially your kind of your invuln kind of thing. And this in
Hmm.
40k would be called the feel no pain, which would be work totally differently. Where after you lose, let's say 3 wounds from a cannonball, you would then roll 3 dice to see if any of them got feel no pained, and then maybe
Hmm.
not lost. However, with regen, you
Yep.
don't do that. You roll it before you lose the wound. So if you hit somebody who has a regen 5 up with a cannonball, they just have an armor save, possibly a ward save, and then a regen save, and all three of them can just negate all of the damage, which is
Yeah.
it streamlines it a
Definitely
little
feel
bit,
bad.
but it does make it so that it's just an all or nothing, right?
Well, the problem is not necessarily that regen is different. The problem is it is too easy for too many Lord level powerhouse characters to have all three. That is the problem. And so once you start having you stack all three of them of, I have a 3 up or 2 up armor save, and I have a 5 up ward save, and I have a 5 up regen save. It is just such one, it slows the game down quite a bit, and two, it's a really feel bad moment, and it's really you're just, in my opinion, making the characters way too defensive. So there are multiple ways this could be solved in terms of it's not a all or nothing, as Evan was saying. It could be reduction by half. It could be it only, it reduces if it to counter to multi wounds, right? Like, hey, if someone's hitting you with multi wounds, if you regen, it would reduce the multi wounds, but you still take the wound, but it's only one. Or it could be you could only do a ward save or a regen save. There are many ways that the team could go about resolving this, or just not let characters stack them. You may take a ward save or a regen save. You may not take both. You may choose. So a lot of ways this could be solved. I'm glad regeneration is in the game. I wish it felt more different than ward. It doesn't feel different enough from ward right now. Besides
Yeah.
that, fire could potentially stop it if you're flammable. Before it used to be fire always stopped regeneration. Now that it doesn't, you have to have the flammable rule. That, to my mind, is the delta between it felt more balanced before because you had a way to shut it down. Now you don't because now flammable is a separate rule. You can't just say great. Before you would always try to take fire on as many weapons as possible to shut down regen. Now it doesn't do that. Now it's this really awful stacking situation. So I think I get what they were trying to do. It felt like it was too easy to shut it down before, but I think it swung way too hard the other way, where it's just really frustrating to have these triple stacked saves in the game.
It definitely frustrates you if you don't bring Monster Slayer to just auto slay them because Monster Slayer and Killing Blow do skip regen, so that's cool.
But as we said
Yeah.
earlier, not everybody has access to that.
I really would much prefer that regen was like, okay, at the start of my turn, everyone who has regen, you roll dice to see how many of the wounds you've lost in the game come back, right?
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
That
So it's
worked
almost
too.
like
That's
you
another,
could,
yeah.
which you could then get killed if you do die all the way, or you're almost like undead where you just start healing. I think that would be more fun, and it would change the order
Yeah,
of
I agree.
operations from a triple save
I
to
think that'd be a
a
lot more fun.
and it would also even potentially combat what I'm complaining about with multi wounds, where just slowly chunking them down a couple wounds at a time is better on average than doing all at once. Well, not against regen then, because if you did all at once, then they don't heal. Whereas,
Yep.
like even just a unit of skeletons, if you had 40 of them to start with, and then 8 of them got killed in my first turn, I roll the 8 dice, and on any 6, I get a skeleton back, right? That's at the start of the turn instead of at that exact moment when it just happened. Be kind of cool.
Yeah, and now and they do that in 40K with the Necron
Yeah,
regeneration rules.
Necron
They've
regeneration
tried
kind of thing.
many different versions of Necron regeneration, and so that would be another totally acceptable solution. So again, it feels like this is. I'm glad regeneration is the game. It feels like it's a dated rule. It feels it's way too identical in this edition to Ward Save. I think there are many ways they could go about revising it for hopefully. I don't think they will this edition. Hopefully next edition to make it feel more distinct. And I think going perhaps the Necron route is a totally acceptable route. I think that's a great rule system, and it creates more play and variety and more play styles, right? Which, as everyone was saying, well, if I survive on one, or things could come back. But right now, it doesn't create any play style variety. It's just tripling down on the save, which is not fun.
So we have regimental unit, and this is one of the rules that just connects with detachments. So we'll cover that when we talk about the formations, because regiment and detachment are kind of like a formation where they're combined together and also separate. So we'll
Mhm.
talk about that when we talk about the close order, open order, skirmish. We talk about those rules kind of all as one thing. Um, require 2 hands. So Basically, it's a lot simpler than it used to be. It used to be in older editions that like if you had a hand weapon and a pistol, you could use one in each hand. Like you could literally count the number of hands you had and say, "I've got two things. I get to have an extra attack. Cool."
Hmm.
But now required two hands makes it a little bit simpler. It's basically just you can use a shield or you can't use a shield.
Hmm.
That's it. So if you have requires two hands, you can't use a shield. If you don't have requires two hands, you can. So there's no like let's say putting a magic sword in one hand and then a hand weapon in the other to get the extra attack. You can't do that, right?
Yep,
So
and this is always part of the game. Yep,
I get, but I guess it was a little more open ended, where like there might be some reasons to
it was.
not fill both of your hands up as a combat character. Where nowadays, if especially if let's say you're a wizard, there's no reason that to not have a requires two hands weapon as like let's say a wizard like a vampire lord because you can't use a shield anyway and still cast spells. So you might as well just buy the two handed weapon like a great weapon or whatever.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The system used to be a little bit more open, and then a little bit more customization allowed because of the way they've made those changes, as Evan said. Now, well, some of those reasons have been removed. Yep,
Yeah, so
it's
it's
very true.
generally a bit of a downside. However, a lot of times you don't care anyway because your unit either has the requires two hand weapon and doesn't have any shields, so you couldn't use them
Hmm.
anyway, or it's a
Hmm.
character who couldn't use a shield anyway, or you get such a good weapon to trade off that you don't need the shield.
Yep. All right, moving on.
Reserve, oh god, reserve move is very strong. Basically, it just lets you
Oh yeah.
move again at the end of the shooting phase if you didn't march, charge, or flee. So
Hmm.
very often, what this lets you do is things like I'm going to move within range to shoot my magic missiles at you with my unit that has a wizard
Yep.
in it, and then I'm going to reserve move
Yep.
away again to get either to a safe position, behind a hill, behind a forest, you can't see me anymore, or just out of dispel range or something.
Hmm.
Or vice
Hmm.
versa. You can reserve move out of dispel range, cast all the spells I want, and then reserve move. Or yeah, so move out of range, do all the spells, reserve move back in range, so then I can stop you when it's your turn because you don't get to have fun.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, but effectively, right, because it doesn't allow you to charge further or march further because those don't stack. Effectively, this is a way to either help units that are shooting and or wizards that want to get within range, shoot their spells, or get out of range for dispel. So effectively, this is a rule that really helps ranged attacks. Could again also very useful for undead things like banshees and such. But effectively, this is a rule that is empowering significantly ranged attacks and or wizards that are also using ranged spells. Yes,
Yeah.
very, very powerful.
So we have scouts, which is a deployment rule. It lets you deploy basically after everyone else goes. You can put them down anywhere that's not 12 inches from an enemy unit. You do alternate, so if both people have scouts, you go one then the other. They
Mhm.
can't charge on their first turn, but otherwise you kind of just get to have these units just drop down, behind enemy lines. Oftentimes you can put them somewhere to either screen out enemy scouts, screen out ambushers,
Mhm.
or for example to block Pegasus Knights who are about to Vanguard from being able to see past a wall of Dark Riders to something they want to charge behind them. I do that a
Mhm.
lot.
Or the dwarf, right? The Death Stars, right? Who want to do a whole bunch of pregame move and move really, really fast their turn one. This is a great thing to just get some really cost-effective speed bumps to slow that Death Star really powerful brick down. So, scouting is great. It's very, very powerful. If your army can take scouts, I always recommend it at least one, if not two, cost-effective scout units. There, the utility of them is very meaningful.
All right, so we also have Shield Wall. Shield Wall is really really cool. So once per game. So again, this is only once. But if during the turn you are charged, a unit with this rule can then. Uh, so if you have to be in close order, you have to be equipped with a shield. You have to choose to use your shield. So if you have hammers or whatever, they have to choose to use the shields instead of their hammer that they've got.
Hmm.
Then they
Hmm.
can give ground instead of fall back in good order after that result. Now that can be very very useful to say, okay, you've got some cavalry with some lances or some impact hits from a chariot. I'm going to eat that for one turn, but then I can give ground and definitely not take it the second turn,
Hmm.
which doesn't work for his Cathay's Lancers. The latest one of the articles that came out said that hey, their little lances they have that are different than regular lances, they can still count as charging even after you just give ground.
Yeah, well, again, the every rule has an exception to the rule.
Yeah,
I think Shield Wall is really, really cool. I think it's challenging to be able to use it effectively because of all the caveats, and in general, because of the current strength or lack of strength of infantry in the game, we're just not seeing a whole bunch of large bricks of infantry with shields. I'm hoping we're going to see some updates in the next wave of FAQs to the game, where we are going to see some buffs to infantry. So hopefully, we will see more of those big bricks of ranked up walls of infantry with shields, in which case I think we're going to see this rule go into effect a lot more often.
Oh, so we finally reached the skirmisher rules. So skirmishers, again, another formation talked about during the formation rules. In fact, probably just an
Yeah,
entire video just about how skirmishers work or how they don't.
probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big video, so we'll cover that separately.
Stomp attacks. Stomp attacks are just extra attacks you get to make that don't have to roll to hit. They're
Hmm.
made at initiative 1, so you have to survive
Hmm.
long enough to still be able to make them. For example, I'm often charging into a hell pit abomination. I'm like, please, for the love of God, can I kill it before it stomps me? Because that's the scary part, right?
Hmm. Oh yeah.
However, you kill it, then it just. I have a really bad result with rolling the timber result. You always just seem to fall on me with your stuff.
The
And
timber
then
rule is amazing.
in one of
Oh,
my
I
most
love it.
recent games, I was playing against Leo
Timber.
Skaven, right? And I charged a battle-lusted Wargore on his chariot straight into a Hell Pit Abomination, and I killed the Hell Pit Abomination, who then rolled Timber, fell on me, did 2 wounds to me with the
Nice.
Timber, and
Love
then
it.
he rolled too horrible to die and came back to life and then attacked me with stomps.
That's amazing. That's
So he was
amazing.
able to fall on me
Uh,
first and then come back to life. So
Oh, yes, but you're talking about different rules. But so stomp attacks, right? They're very effective. Honestly, they're quite frankly a little too powerful in the game because they're so prolific amongst the behemoths, which we see in almost all the games currently. Again, we want to see big monsters in the game. You want to see dragons and giants and other things in the game, but the character writing behemoths are just so strong. And what makes them so strong is often the stomp attacks, because typically they only have like 4 attacks, right? And they still have to hit and they still have to wound. And so forth and so on. But stomps, they just auto hit. That's what makes them so powerful. And then they auto hit, and then they're being resolved with the same strength of a normal attack of the behemoth, or typically the big monster itself. There are smaller things that do have stomp attacks 1 or not as or X necessarily, but again, this is the most prolific on the behemoths. And you're rolling that D6 a lot of the time. You're right. You're getting rolled that 4, 5, 6 more stomp attacks that auto hit, and you find the damage output of the monster is far more from the stomp attacks than anything else. So the downside is it happens at the end. But again, the big monsters typically don't die in that first before they get to swing at least one stomp attack, because they have a lot of armor, or a lot of defense, or a lot of wounds, or really high toughness. So I actually think that stomp attacks are good to have in the game. I love them thematically. They're great in that sense, but I feel that the D6 proliferation of them on all the behemoths is actually too strong in the game for something that auto hits. If it still had to hit, I would feel very differently about it. Or otherwise, I feel it should be D3, should be the most. But just in general, my problem is that I don't feel it's thematically appropriate or fun that the majority of the damage output of a monster is from its stomp and not from its normal attacks. And I don't want them to have more attacks. They already hit really, really hard. So I just feel that stomps just do too much.
So I think my problem with this is a little bit different than yours. First of all, there's a lot of have and have not with either one, like you said, monsters that just have a ton of stomps and monsters that don't, because some monsters have
Hmm.
1 or 2. Dragon ogres
Yeah.
have 2 each for some reason, and some other monsters actually just have 1, even though they're like a 90-point monster or a 100-point monster, right? They're like 1 stomp attack. Um, the fact that you can roll the dice and get 6 stomps and all of them can go into the other participant of a challenge, who could be like a dwarf hero on foot, and he just gets 6 stomps on his face, is very insane to me. Me personally, I
Yeah.
feel like that letting Games Workshop decide that different monsters have different numbers of stomps is a terrible idea. I think stomp should be a single rule, and what it does is every model who's within base contact of you gets 1 hit. So first of all, if you're in challenge, only 1 hit, not D6 of them, not D3 or D3 plus 3, or like my Thunder Tusk does a flat 3 every single time, which is actually better than a D6. I just always do at least a decent number of them. But just if every model that you're in base contact with got a flat 1, then the bigger base would actually give you more hits, potentially. And the smaller base would give you
True.
fewer hits. And so bigger monsters would just do more hits.
And don't get me wrong, you are solving the challenge problem, but you're
Yeah.
not solving your dragon ogre problem. Now your dragon ogres are going to get 4 stomps per dragon ogre. So these rules need to be thought out
They just shouldn't have
thoroughly.
it, I don't think.
No, they probably shouldn't, but I think generally speaking, there are multiple ways this could be approached. And the main point we're trying to make is it is too powerful.
Yeah.
It's skewing the game. It's creating awkward situations that don't feel thematic or correct. And we'd love to see this rule get a revision, hopefully in the
Yeah,
future.
and then the second thing I was going to say is just the fact that you've got a behemoth gets to have AP2 on its stomp attacks and regular monsters get AP0 is such a dramatic, enormous shift between those two
Huge
things
delta.
that any monster that's not a behemoth doesn't see any play almost at all. Mike, what's a monster that's not a behemoth that sees the table?
Not many. I'll take my Abyssal Terror sometimes. Um,
Just Tomb Scorpion. That's all I can think of.
Pegasus, Payatun Corp. Yeah, but exactly right. And so, yeah, again, the AP on top of that is also the problem. So,
And in particular,
I
AP2 really nukes infantry. There's a lot of infantry in the game that either has heavy armor and a great weapon, or it has light armor shield. So they're standing there like, yeah,
yeah,
we're here. We want to actually fight. And then D6 of them just get no armor save at all and just get crushed to death.
yeah, and that would be again another way to solve it. If Stomp attacks, even Behemoths, just didn't have AP at all, then like
Or
okay,
just one, not two, just -1 would be fine.
there are many ways
Yeah.
to approach this, but right now it is just significantly over. It's doubling down on the things that already hit really hard and are really effective. It's making them significantly more effective, and the things that really would benefit from this, those mid-size or other things, are not seeing the benefit.
So
So this
what the
really needs
whole
another.
situation, and we've described this with the triple save, with things like stomp attacks, what it makes is it makes haves and have-nots, which means your battle is between units that don't have all these rules, like core units and little scouts and skirmishers. They're fighting each other, and then next to them are these absolute tank god tier units that could definitely crush them like a bug if they want to. But most of the time, they're too busy dealing with the other god tier units. So there's kind of this. It's like having a bunch of battleships shooting at each other, while a couple little like frigates and patrol boats are hanging out nearby.
Yep, and we'd like to see that the bottom be brought up a little bit and the down be brought down a little bit. So, all right, moving on.
So last one for today, we have strikes first. Another rule that causes contention a little bit because the way it's written, it says, hey, if you're during combat phase, if you have strikes first, your initiative becomes 10.
Mhm.
Well, what happens if your weapon gives you that and you want to cast Special Doppelganger, which gives you that rule, and they change their minds 4 times on how that's supposed to work? Because they really don't want a wizard to buy the strikes first sword and get to do Special Doppelganger at initiative 10 for some
Yep.
reason.
Yeah, but that's specifically to that special doppelganger thing. So I think the biggest thing that we're talking about here that they did do that I do appreciate is, and they had a lot of confusion in other editions and a lot of confusions in 40K, and 40K went about how it solved it. But I really like initiative is important to this game. Initiative is an important stat. I love how
Mm-hmm.
critical it is. I love how when you charge you get more initiative. I love that this is a crunchy, fun, exciting depth to the game, and I do really appreciate that. Hey, strike last just means your base initiative gets chunked down to 1, but you can still then apply charge bonuses or other things. Strike first means your base initiative gets raised up to 10, right? So rather than well, I'm striking first. Well, I'm striking first. Well, who's striking first? Nope, we're just changing
Who's on first
our
base,
stat
Mike?
values. Right. It's just changing the stat values, and it's. I think it's pretty clear. It's pretty clean. Not a lot of confusion there once you explain it to people. The doppelganger rule is this one exception, but that's specific to that spell, and they're rewriting it. And again, they didn't think through all the repercussions of that, so that's a wholly different thing. But I love that initiative matters in this game, and I think they've done a lot of improvements in this edition. And I also like how they handled strike first and strike last.
See, I'm going to totally disagree with you.
That's okay.
In particular, Strikes Last, I really don't like because it takes into account not at all what the initiative you started with was. So a dwarf with initiative 2 great weapon is just dropped down to 1, whereas the White Lancer
Yeah.
initiative 5 with a great weapon are dropped down to 1. And so Strikes Last in particular really feels like a haves not situation again, which we don't need it to be that way. I think that first of all, every other game that Games Workshop has doesn't have initiative in it anymore, and so what they do instead is things like a great weapon would just have -1 to hit, instead of a lower initiative. That's potentially a route we could see going down in the future. Or you could just have minus penalty, like you just have -3 to your initiative. Now I think they did strikes first, strikes last because they didn't want people to have to do as much math. Because again, if I have -3 to my initiative to a minimum of 1, that actually means a lot of math needs to happen for me to figure out what part I'm doing it at when I also charge or whatever. You know what I mean?
This just sounds like some high elf complaining that you're not just always faster than everybody.
Yes.
That's okay. But there are different ways to approach it. But I think we are glad that initiative is still in the game. There certainly are opportunities here for other things. And I think that is, to Evan's point, though, it is worth pointing out that elves in previous editions just pretty much always struck first all the time, no matter what. That is not true in this edition with the changes they've made. Some people probably like that a bit more, perhaps the dwarves and the mics of the world. And certainly the high elf players who are like, why am I not always hitting first, or maybe not as happy about that change? And, okay, well, I'm not say they're right or wrong. That is absolutely a change from previous editions.
Well, just remember that the next time you're facing down an ethereal white lion block, that's the only thing they can do to not die. So
Yeah, you're not wrong about that. But that's a whole separate problem of other benefits and things. All right, so we got through strike first. Is that as far as we're going to get this episode?
yes,
All right,
we
any
are.
last words, Evan?
Just that everyone needs to stay legendary and don't take a skirmishers. Don't
We'll talk about that
please
next time.
don't make your entire army. Whenever I see someone with a trace list and they have 5 or 6 units of Creation Woodsman as their core, and then the rest of their stuff is just characters and a couple flying things, I'm like, no.
Yeah. All right. Well,
No.
we'll talk about that in a separate video. All right. We got one more special rules to go through, and we'll tackle that next time. We'll see y'all later. Bye.